thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. So for our Women in Leadership series, would you be able to introduce yourself and a little bit more about your career today?
Certainly. So to explain the accent, I am Canadian, not American. I find it's important to say that up front. And I kind of bucket my career into two big buckets. I spent the first significant chunk of my career working in large multinationals. Okay. So I worked for British Airways, I worked for Sainsbury's, I worked for Sir Richard Branson for 5 years launching new Virgin businesses. I then went to Barclays and worked at Barclaycard and their wealth management division, then moved to PayPal where I was head of strategy for EMEA based in Luxembourg, then took on global strategy based in San Jose, oversaw the IPO in 2015 on NASDAQ, came back to Luxembourg to take on full P&L responsibility for Central and Eastern Europe, Middle East and Africa, so 110 markets from Finland in the north to South Africa in the south. And when I left PayPal, I wanted to try something a bit different and be a bit more hands-on, so I joined a Series A backed startup in subscription commerce, and I've worked for a biotech, an ed tech, and an ad tech business. And then most recently in terms of exec, I set up and ran the European operations of a Canadian Fintech called Clearco. And for the last 3 years or so, I've been doing non-exec roles. I sit on board of a venture capital trust called Gresham House Income and Growth 2, VCT PLC. It's listed on the LSE, and I chair their investment committee. And I also sit on the board of VeloBank, which is a Polish bank, the ninth largest bank in Poland, which was bought by Cerberus a year ago. And I sit on every one of the committees of the board as well.
A very, very interesting career to date, Sarah.
That's a word for it. Interesting, yes. Mm-hmm.
Highly experienced, highly knowledgeable. Obviously, you're in the non-exec world now as Ned. So if I could go back a little bit in your career with you, the bigger corporates, the corporate institutions, you then went on to smaller fintech, ad tech. How did you deal or navigate those changes in terms of nuances that you came across?
Yeah, it's, I think it depends on the situation. At PayPal, as opposed to, so at Barclays, obviously, it's a very large institution. I was in the UK headquarters, I'm in Canary Wharf, lots of process, lots of structure, lots of people and resources. PayPal in Europe, though PayPal generates 2/3 of its profit globally from EMEA, the EMEA organization itself was 700 people across 5 different markets. So it was a much leaner organization as opposed to Barclays, and consequently it was a little bit, well, not a little bit, it was a lot more kind of dynamic, and you just had to get stuck in, and you often didn't have the resources you really would have liked and all that kind of stuff. So actually I didn't find the transition to smaller startups to be this huge shock. I will say, as I say, it kind of depends on the organization and their state of readiness and where they are in that kind of startup journey. I was a little surprised joining a fintech. While they weren't regulated, they still were dealing with money, and their approach to decision making was surprising to me in terms of not being overwhelmingly data led. It was what the founders thought was cool, which I kind of thought was not necessarily the most appropriate way to make a decision. And I was given the feedback. I was building a business case about our expansion into Germany, and I got told business cases are quote unquote too corporate.
Oh, right.
Yes. And I was like, okay, and how would we make these decisions? And it was literally, if we think it's cool. They had
way of doing it.
It was indeed. So I'm not going to lie, I found that slightly frustrating, but I don't think that's necessarily about it being a smaller business. It was the era, it was the huge fintech rah-rah, and the board was pushing the 2 founders for growth at all costs. So some of the metrics that I expected around profitability and EBITDA and those kinds of things. They just had no interest in whatsoever. So I think it depends a little bit on the situation.
Yeah, very situational by the sound of it. You've clearly been involved in a lot of strategic growth for a multitude of the companies for which you've worked. From your experience, how has that lent itself to being successful in the non-exec director world?
I think, well, it's interesting because if you read job descriptions for non-exec directors, often number 1 or 2 on the job description is to set and agree the strategy of the business. Yet when you look at the profile of the people that go onto boards, very rarely, almost never, is it a former chief strategy officer or those kinds of things. They don't actually have that much interest in having those people around the table. So it's been very interesting for me, because I do have a strong background in strategy, to sit at that table. So in particular at VeloBank at the moment, we have a board meeting next week, and we are meant to be reviewing the new strategy for the business banking segment. I've already dipped my oar in and spoken to the team a little while ago to give them a heads up in terms of, here's my background. This is not going to be a softball kind of conversation. I am going to ask you questions, and these are the types of things that I expect to see when you present, and it's not just pretty slides. I want to understand what the implementation plan is, and I will be holding you accountable for that. And I think it's quite helpful having that background of having to present strategy to boards in the past. So I kind of, in theory, know what good looks like, and can kind of give them that coaching and insight, hopefully to the betterment of the business. I think also, both in the large and the small companies that I've worked in, not everything works.
Yeah.
And that's an important, I think, particularly if you're in the fintech space, etc., a lot of it is about test and learn, and you need to come with the attitude that if something doesn't work, that's not in and of itself a bad thing. That's a learning.
That's a learning.
As long as you use it as learning, and you don't beat people up for having tried something that didn't work, etc. And again, I think when I look around the table at VeloBank and even at Venture Capital Trust, where we are investing in high growth businesses, and by its very nature, not all of those investments pan out. But I am the only person around that board table who has operating experience, who has built a high growth business from scratch, and knows some of the pitfalls to watch out for, because I've seen the movie and I can see where it can go wrong. Doesn't mean I'm omniscient, but at least I can hopefully help people avoid repeating mistakes. Because again, almost regardless of industry, smaller high growth businesses have a tendency to make the same kinds of mistakes. So you can actually bring those learnings from different organizations, and I think it's helpful to have that voice at the table.
Yeah, I think sometimes it's a case of you don't know what you don't know. So having somebody, as you said, around the table with the operational expertise and the strategic expertise like you're able to show them what good has looked like. You rightly mentioned where the pitfalls might occur, and then how to mitigate those.
Insofar as possible, yes.
And ideal world.
Yes, in an ideal world. I mean, because just because something worked here doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work here, and vice versa. You have to have that kind of openness and curiosity to make sure that you're not, this is how it's always been done, because that's not going to be super helpful either. But there are lots of things that look great on paper, but if you've done them once, you may be like, actually, you should think about this, because that may come back to bite you on the bahookie later on. Yeah.
So can I ask you
You can try.
from being around the table and having key input into strategies and the vision or mission statements of a lot of these companies, how have you seen maybe some of these shift, or maybe the transient journey over the last decade potentially of key changes in that fintech sector?
Oh gosh. Well, certainly I think you know, if you go pre-COVID and into that absolute peak of fintech frenzy, there was a lot of money sloshing around the ecosystem. And to be brutally honest, I'm not sure it was necessarily invested in maybe the most valid business concepts, shall we say.
By the wayside, haven't we?
Yeah, and I can remember coming out of PayPal, which is getting on for almost a decade ago now, and back then everything was about the sexy GUI, the user interface, and people very much focused on the tech part of fintech, and they didn't think about that first syllable and how important regulatory compliance is, and fundamentally you need to be solving a problem. And that was an issue at PayPal as well. When they tried to go into offline payments at one point, I, for my sins, had to lead it for Europe, and I kept having to go back to California where all product was developed. And as you may know, the US is a good decade behind Europe when it comes to payments. So at that point, they didn't even have contactless technology, which had been introduced by Barclays 6 years before here. And so they were building this ridiculous app thing where you had to bring up the app and show your face and then find the merchant, and then it took 5 minutes to make a payment, and it was all the men in California kept going, but it's great because it's on the phone, and I'm like, but
it seemed a little bit convoluted.
It was massively convoluted, and I kept trying to explain to them that in Europe we had contactless, and yes, at that point this was pre-Apple Pay, so at that point it was only on your card, but all I had to do was tap the card, which I already had in my wallet, thank you ever so much. And it took me fractions of a second. And what merchant wants some doofus stood at the checkout for 5 minutes trying to get this stuff through the app? It was very much about form factor rather than solving an actual problem for the consumer or the merchant, whoever your kind of addressable market is. And there was a lot of that back then. And I think now, because funding has become much more scarce, shall we say, and there is now that shift away from growth at all costs, this is much more either you are profitable or you have a very clear path to profitability. That means that businesses are much more focused on solving a genuine problem and building a sustainable business with an economic model that is actually generating profit. And that's a huge change from 8-10 years ago, I would say.
And coming on to your point, it's been mentioned a little bit in other chats that I've had similar to you with other ladies, where you were talking interestingly about the tech. Everybody focused on the tech. Whereas the fin element of, my world GRC, it was always seen as a barrier to entry, a hurdle, maybe preventative from business, but actually it's an enabler. We do a lot of roundtables talking about this. It's just how the business views it, and it's got to be the right tone from the top.
Yes, and it can be, again, within PayPal, say, at the time, and I think it's still true, to be honest. So at the time that I was there, we had a license from the CSSF in Luxembourg. We were regulated as a bank in Luxembourg, whereas the US business is not regulated. And I believe that has not changed. And very much the view in Silicon Valley was all regulation is bad, and this whole concept that we have a banking license, what a pain, and we have to do all this reporting, and oh my God. And everyone in Europe was like, no, this is a wonderful thing. This is a genuine moat against our competitors, and it means people can put trust in PayPal because they know that we adhere to all European regulations, et cetera, et cetera. And there were some lovely corporate tax benefits for PayPal as a company as well. But the Americans really just viewed any form of regulation as bad. So even within the same organization, you can have very different views as to whether that GRC is actually enabling your business or creating that moat, making it more difficult for others to come along and be Me Too's. Because that was a huge issue at Clearco, the last Canadian fintech I was at, which was in the revenue-based finance space and consequently was not regulated. And there were a number of competitors. So they started in the North American market, and they were the market leader in North America. And there were several competitors in Europe who literally copied and pasted the website, all they did was change the font and the colors. The pricing was exactly like it was letter perfect the same. And there was no regulatory moat to stop someone from creating essentially an identical business model. And it became a little bit of the race to the bottom in terms of pricing and those kinds of things. So, these are, from a strategic perspective, things one should think about in terms of, can you create that moat to make your model truly unique?
Yeah. It's certainly a very interesting topic. I'll probably speak to you all day about it, to be honest. I do want to focus a little bit on your kind of rise and progression into the NED world. So talking about leadership and that next level for you, how did you first kind of enter that leadership role? Was that always the case for you, or did you?
So this is on the executive side?
Yes.
So no, I mean, my first real P&L ownership role was at PayPal.
Okay.
And I was very fortunate in that the CEO of EMEA essentially took a chance on me when I was head of strategy for EMEA, and we agreed that I would take on that role before I went to California. And that really kind of set me on a footing for my future roles, because it is one of those things that everyone's looking for someone who has that experience already.
Yes.
And no one's willing to kind of give it to you to start. So it wasn't like I came out fully formed. And I think it was also quite fortunate in that role. I inherited an incredibly strong team across that region, and it was such a diverse region. I had everything from Israel, which is super sophisticated, through to Botswana, which is absolutely not sophisticated, and so in terms of leveraging the skill set I already had in terms of strategy and analysis and those kinds of things, it let me play to my strengths, being able to do things across that very complex region, and leverage my network back in California, because a lot of my role is about advocating for that region back in the HQ, and that kind of let me play from a position of strength, and then leverage my team, who are fantastic sales leaders and those kinds of things, and enable them to do their jobs really, really well, which then kind of set me up, as I say, for doing things going forwards.
Very good. And how did you kind of set those teams up? What would you say your style is for success?
So it was quite interesting coming into that role in particular, in that I had a very different style to my predecessor. He believed in kind of creative destruction, and he would set different leaders up in competition with each other.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Which is one way of approaching it. And so when I came in and took on the role, I brought my team together in Luxembourg. They were all men, and the first thing they all told me was they'd never worked for a woman before. I'm like, well, here you go, here's your chance.
Interesting.
And I also said, look, new sheriff in town, we're going to do things differently. Yes, I hold you accountable for across those 110 markets, that was then broken down into 4 smaller sub-regions, and I had market heads for each of those. And I'm like, look, I look to you to be accountable for your region's performance, but when we come together as a leadership team, we are a team. And this isn't about throwing other people under the bus. This is, if you can help someone, you help them, and they will help you back. And to kind of embed that philosophy in the team, I gave each of them a pan-regional project that they had to work on with a cross-functional team with people from within and outside their own regions. And once a quarter, they had to come back and present to the group as a whole how that project was progressing. And A, it helped to kind of reinforce that behavior. B, it gave them a platform to go back to California, which was quite important, with a meaningful topic that wasn't just about Central Eastern Europe or Africa. This was a significant chunk of revenue as a general whole, which then gave them a platform to engage with people meaningfully there, which meant I could get 3 of my 5 direct reports promoted within a year, which was super helpful. So that my style is all about that kind of collaboration. I also kind of believe in the golden rule, do unto others as you'd have done unto you. And I hate being micromanaged. So my default style is not that. It's much more, let's agree what the objective is. You go away. You have a question, come at, like, I'm always here. Let's whiteboard it out. Happy to kind of thrash it out. But, particularly with that team, they knew their regions far better than I did. I'm not here to tell you what to do on a day-to-day basis. I'm here to enable you to be better. Yeah. So help me work out what resources you need, what support you need, and then I'll go and shout until we get it. That was kind of the bargain I made with them. And that's how I'm all about making you better. Yeah.
Yeah, you make a lot of very valid points there about the support and the collaboration and giving them the opportunity to come back to you. But that empowerment of autonomy kind of really shines through. And in your career, did you have somebody in your professional or personal life who was a mentor to you that maybe guided you to become that leadership style, or was that innate in you?
It's a good question. I don't think I had a kind of one particular mentor. I think having worked across the many different businesses that I have, I've had a lot of different leaders in my own career, and I've kind of seen what worked well with me. And as I say, it was kind of, that's interesting. Kind of begged, borrowed, and stole is about to be grammatically incorrect, stole things from people in terms of how can I leverage that. I'll never forget one of the best people managers I've ever seen in my whole career was a peer of mine at Sainsbury's. We were in the direct marketing team sending out those annoying offers you get in the post using the Nectar card data. That was us. As I say, she had left school at 16. She started out on the shop floor at Sainsbury's, and then she moved into HQ and was running a big chunk of the DM team. And I still, to this day, when I'm kind of thinking about team-related issues, I'll think, what would Rachel do in this circumstance? Because she was just amazing at really caring about her team and how they could deliver more and all that. And I just sat and admired her a lot.
Yeah. I think that's it. It's learning maybe from what you've seen about the good that you'd like to take with you, and maybe also the not so good that you'd like to try and
not a lot of that.
Not repeat. Yeah. And it's that learning of what would then work for you and your team to be successful.
And also for the individual. I mean, one of the big learnings when I Sainsbury's was the first time I had direct line management experience, relevance for people. And there was someone in my team. As I say, my style is very hands-off. Come to me and have a question, but you go and do. And I had a young man in my team who, quite frankly, he had been sent from pillar to post around the organization and was kind of tarred with a certain brush, and was a bit lost. And it was down to the point where I literally he was sat at the desk next to me, and every morning we're like, so what are we going to do today? So what do we do today? Which is, again, not my natural style, but I just needed to get him in a position that he did feel confident. So you have to sometimes flex away from your default style to suit the circumstance. So if there's a crisis or you have an individual that needs a little bit of
I agree. And those various people that you've learned some really good traits or behaviours or experiences from in the way of mentors or just peers, was there a role model specifically or potentially that you aspired to be or was inspirational to you?
There are two things that kind of come to mind. So one, my first manager at British Airways was a woman called Sarah Newman, and she had just incredible integrity. And I can remember, she was my boss during 9/11, so which was, an existential crisis for the airline. And the way she conducted herself throughout that whole experience and how she treated she ran not only strategy but also operations research, etc. And I can remember, literally just sitting there and watching her and how she did things. And I was like, that is something to be emulated for sure. And then when I worked at Virgin Management, which is Sir Richard Branson's private equity fund, essentially. So they are very careful and very deliberate around culture. And culture fit is not just a phrase they throw around in terms of recruiting. They really stick to it. And they were very concise in kind of describing what a Virgin person was. And it was very much around not getting hung up on what your job title was or, what your business card said. It's, if something needs doing, you go do it. That's the Virgin ethos. And it, and back in those days, Virgin was, a bit of a bigger brand than it is today. And many of my business school classmates and stuff are like, oh, you're so lucky to work at Virgin. And I was like, well, I'm not sure you would actually like it here because you never had an army of minions. You got the tea, you built the spreadsheet, you also went to number 10 Downing Street for breakfast, you did all of it. And if you're big on status, you're not going to enjoy this. But I really did, and that has always inspired my ethos in terms of if something needs doing, who cares if it's in your job description or not, you do it. And that has been quite formative, I think, for me.
And culture's an interesting one. We talk about it all the time with certainly where we operate in search and talent acquisition. It's an interesting one because it's people build the culture. People are the culture. But I think also you've got to have the right tone from the top and that being embedded.
Yes, and certainly one of the interesting things about Virgin that I found really special is the way they used stories to communicate that culture. So, and some of that was very deliberate. So some of there are stories that have practically taken on the status of legend within Virgin. They talk about, the airline, a little kid showing up in South Africa who'd been to the fair and he won a goldfish at the fair. And at the cabin door, he can't take it. This is pre-liquids, I like to say. But and the poor little fish, Freddie the fish, has to go, and tears and what have you. And the cabin services director rings to Heathrow and gets someone to go to the local pet shop to give him a goldfish when they arrive on the ground. So he gets a new goldfish. So there are stories like that, which are very much about kind of the Virgin style of service. But even in the HQ, where we aren't interacting with customers, when I first joined, I was told a story about a man who had previously run the team, but he'd left the business 8 years ago, and people were still talking about this man because apparently he never said good morning to anyone in the morning. And people still talked about it 8 years ago. And let me tell you, I worked there for the best part of 5 years, and I was very fortunate I could walk to work, but often I was cutting it fine. The building was 3 stories, and often you had to, I would literally be pelting up the stairs to get to a meeting. But you cross someone in the stairs, and every time I stopped to say, good morning, how are you? Because that was an important part of the culture, the whole building of relationships. But the way that was communicated to me was not, you need to say good morning, but it was more, I'm going to tell you about this guy who never said good morning to everyone, and you're going to be talked about for the rest of your life if you don't do it. So that was very much part of the Virgin ethos, was using that storytelling as a way of inculcating that culture. So I take your point, and certainly, as I say, a big part of it was around hiring and selecting individuals who kind of fit into that. And less so at Virgin would I say it was around incentives in terms of incentivizing, but it was much more about how do you reinforce the behaviors that we want people to demonstrate, and for them storytelling was a big part of that.
And interestingly, you've mentioned around that diversity, certainly to maintain that culture. How have you ensured, or maybe some of the companies that you are now a non-exec for, how have they ensured that that diversity is a key policy, but it's actually being executed? So what methods do you or they take?
So obviously in the bank, some of that is kind of regulatorily mandated in terms of they have to track some of the kind of key identifiers. I would say in Poland it's far less about racial diversity. It tends to be more around gender diversity, and at each level of the business. And it is something that we as a supervisory board are tracking and questioning.
But it's being tracked and measured.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, we are asking, they have decent, not great, but decent diversity on what's called the management board. Yeah. But when you start going levels down, the picture isn't as pretty, and we are asking questions around the pipeline and making sure that they are actually ensuring that we will improve as opposed to degrade over time. Interestingly, in the venture fund, when we do rarely look at some of the statistics across the portfolio, the picture's not pretty, as is, I think more broadly the case for venture. As most people know, only 2% of venture funding in the UK goes to female-led businesses, and I think in our portfolio it's barely that. Okay. So it's not, at the moment, it's not something that we are actively setting targets for in terms of we need to have a certain proportion of female-led or ethnic diversity, those kinds of things. It is kind of interesting when you because the way the fund operates, and particularly for me as chair of the investment committee, each investment comes in individually. We are typically looking at a cluster of 3 or 4. It's one, and then each quarter we look at portfolio performance overall. So because you're evaluating each investment on its merits on a standalone basis, and that tends to be solely on financial metrics. So while we look at strength of the management team, what experience they have, those kind of, whether anyone in the broader network knows them, can reference them, those kinds of things, it's not typically, do they have a woman on their team, or
it's more financial performance metrics,
which is unfortunate, but as a director, I'm there to represent the shareholders who care about the returns that they get.
Yeah. What do you think could be done differently then to really look at that diversity pool? Because what often comes up with us is it's not just the gender or the ethnicity or the race. It's also social mobility, diversity of thinking, in backgrounds where people haven't always been afforded opportunity. So what do you think could be done differently, Sarah?
It's a very good question, and unfortunately I wish I had a silver bullet for you.
If we all had the answers,
it would all be done already, because it is kind of pernicious. But although I will say, if I look across our portfolio, at least on things like social mobility, etc., that seems to be less. We are running around backing Posh Boy partially because Gresham House itself, it's not Goldman Sachs, it's not whoever. They aren't necessarily Oxbridge types who are investing in their mates' businesses and those kinds of things. And interestingly, the chief investment officer for Gresham House is ex-Barclays, is a black man who started on the grad scheme at 16 at Barclays. He didn't even go to university. So
that's a great
example. So he has risen to a very senior position. Whether or not that has actually then influenced the composition of the portfolio, question, because that, one of the hypotheses, at least within the venture community, is if you had more female investors, would they back more female-backed businesses or female-founded businesses? And I think there are you look at things like Fintech, etc., where the feedback you get from the founders is when they're faced with a room of male investors, they literally don't get it. They don't understand what the problem that's being solved. But if you flip that on its head, and they've done research in terms of the types of questions that female founders get asked by investors, typically, the statistics show that men are always asked about the upside and women are asked about the downside. It's all about risk mitigation. And that doesn't change when it's a female investor or a male investor, which is interesting. So even a female investor potentially looking to invest in a female founder asks about the downside risk as opposed to, and when they face a male founder, they look at the upside. So there is something inherent.
Yes.
I think that I think having more female investors would be a good thing, but it isn't in and of itself a panacea. It's not. That's not going to solve it. And as I think most people know, Alex DePledge, who is a founder herself, is now currently advising the government, not just on. So there is also a few female founders who are looking specifically at funding for female founders. But I'm pleased that it's a female founder who is advising the government at the moment on their entrepreneur strategy. So someone who's actually got the scars, who might have some better ideas than certainly I do. Because I wish I had it. I wish
That's
I had
a positive step forward, isn't it?
It is, and I'm absolutely confident. I've met Alex a few times. I know someone who is one of her backers, and she didn't get that job because she's a woman. She got that job because she's a great founder. Yeah. She's a serial founder, and she's been very successful. So that in and of itself is great.
And equally from our side, when it's very much search, talent acquisition solutions provider, younger females feel more reassured
when they can see
comfortable in joining an organisation, and we've got the research behind it as well, where there is a female in exec or leadership, because not only is it inspirational, also aspirational, but it's proven. And that, just like exactly why we do this, it's a platform to give more visibility around it. We can see you've been there, done that, testament to you, look at how far you've excelled in your career. So we just want to highlight that more, but it's a proven.
Yes, although the research also shows that the turning point is when there are two women at a leadership table, be that a board table or an exec table. Having one woman reeks of tokenization, and she tends to be marginalized and talked over. When there are two women at the table, that's when you have proof, really. And they've done it. Sadly, I spent a lot of my time reading about this, as you might tell.
Very interesting.
Yes, but so that's, because I have in more than one circumstance been that first woman on the table. And it's hard.
Yeah. Well, I think leading to our kind of final question for the day, you've highlighted a lot of really, really interesting facts, very valid points. From your experience, if you could give any words of wisdom, words of advice to younger female talent, what would that be?
Oh gosh. Free advice, worth every penny. The advice I typically give to younger people is, I think it's really helpful to understand what motivates you.
Yeah.
So for me, my big motivator is learning. And that's part of the reason why I've worked across so many different businesses, different geographies. That's what gets me out of bed in the morning. I love to learn something. And actually, a friend of mine figured that out several years ago. She's like, because, some people are motivated by title and status. Some people are motivated by money. And that's great. But you need to kind of stay true to what your intrinsic motivation is, because, and I can say this, having graduated from Harvard Business School and having just been at my 25-year reunion a few weeks ago, I see my friends who have made squillions, literally, and, have fabulous lives and what have you, and that's great for them. But that doesn't make me any less than, because what I'm doing is learning, and that's important for me, and that gives me satisfaction. And I think if you can figure out what it is that motivates you in that way, then you can define your own success and not get wrapped up in other people's metrics, which hopefully will then lead to fulfillment and ultimately your definition of success.
I think that is a great point. I don't think people talk about that or bring it to light enough. But whatever's right for you.
And just because Bobby loves status, great for him. Let him go and become managing director or whatever, what's it. You do you.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing your journey, your story, all those key pieces of advice, Sarah. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome.